If you're talking about class, are you reducing everything to class society? Now, I would put it in a different way. I would say that actually understanding oppression coming from class doesn't narrow the definition of oppression. It widens the definition of oppression, because it begins to locate it not just in individual relations, but in an exploitative society where the whole basis of society is that profit is made. The whole basis of society is that the people who produce the wealth hang on to their profits, and therefore the idea, and you can look at this if you think about Rupert Murdoch or Rebecca Brooks, who is an ideal kind of woman capitalist, you know, from the point of view of the capitalist class, how convenient for them to have a woman who operates in this kind of way against other women. You look at those sorts of people, or the heads of the banks, or the stockbrokers, or any of these people, the idea that they would take billions of pounds worth of their profits, for example, and turn it towards providing free childcare for everybody, is almost laughable. I mean, it shouldn't be laughable, it should be something that we would expect them to do. But the idea of the minute you said that one of the conditions of employing women workers is that there should be free childcare for everybody, that this should be available, it shouldn't mean that women can't afford to go to work because they can't get childcare. This childcare should be available for their leisure time as well as their working time, all of these kind of things which would genuinely make a difference to women's oppression and this kind of thing. You cannot imagine them doing it without a revolutionary overthrow of their companies and probably of society. The fight for the 35-hour week, which if you think instantly would improve the position of men and women, because one of the main reasons men do less childcare than women is because they tend to work longer hours. You know that very large numbers of men work over 45 hours a week in this country. Now, if you suddenly reduce the hours to 35 a week for both sexes, again you begin to free up people hours and hours of time where they could spend more time looking after their children, doing all sorts of other things, reading Marx's Capital or whatever else they want to do in their spare time. But again, this eats into the profits of the capitalists, and therefore they won't do it. I mean, in a society where we cannot even defend our health service or our libraries or all these kind of things, the idea that they will invest in this kind of money to lessen the impact of women's oppression is simply not the case. So I think you have to look at it in terms of class, but this isn't about saying that only working class women are oppressed. All women are oppressed. It doesn't matter what woman you are. Even Rebecca Brooks is oppressed, although you might not feel at this moment any kind of particular sympathy for her. But all women are oppressed, but the real question here is they are oppressed because of the class system. They're not oppressed because people don't like them individually. They're oppressed because of a class system which defines women as somehow second-class citizens and having to do twice as much as a man in order to prove that they're as good as a man. That's the basic hideous ideology that we have in globalised capitalism. So that's the basic situation I would say. I want to say a little thing before I end about feminism, because feminism is a set of ideas which has been going as long as capitalism, and actually if you look at, since capitalism developed with the great revolutions of the 17th and 18th century, the English Revolution centred here in London, the French Revolution of 1789, these were the first times you ever got ideas about women's equality, and there were very radical ideas about women's equality. In the 17th century there were lots of ideas about free love and things like that, which actually one point that Frederick Engels made is every time there's a revolution, ideas of free love come to the fore, which is an encouraging kind of thought if you think about it. But it's also true that once people start changing the economic society in which they live, they also start changing their relationships, and their old relationships don't necessarily fit, and they begin to think of themselves as different human beings as well as people who fit into a particular social system. So always there have been these feminist ideas. people will have heard probably of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was, in Britain was one of the main proponents of the idea that women should be able to be equal with men, that they should have an education, they should have all of those kind of things. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft was an educated middle-class woman, which most women at the time weren't, and she didn't take her analysis right in the way that we would today about how working class people can also change, but she was very, very important in terms of putting these ideas forward. You had, in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, another burst of feminism, of ideas of women's liberation. Incidentally, these ideas, women's emancipation, as it was called in the 19th century, took its name from the campaign for the emancipation of the slaves in the United States of America. In other words, they identified women's rights with the rights, they identified with people who were struggling against another form of oppression. In the 1960s, when women coined the term women's liberation to describe the movement that they then had, they took that phrase from the struggle of the Vietnamese and the other liberation movements which were going on in Africa and around the world. So there's a real kind of connection here with the rising of a movement and the rising of radical ideas and of left-wing ideas, and of people beginning to look towards feminism and women's liberation to change things. But if you look at women's liberation today, if you look at feminism today, then actually what you find is that there is a real division between those women who connect women's liberation and women's equality with some wider critique of society and some wider sense that you have to overthrow society, and the women who simply think feminism is about getting your place in the media, or your place in management, or your place in the legal profession, or your place in any of those kind of things. And the problem, I think, with feminism, and one reason why, in my view, feminism contributed a lot in the late 60s and early 70s with ideas, with the movement, with the various things went on, but actually has contributed very little since then in terms of ideas, is that it came up against the limits of class society, that you can campaign for women's equality, but as soon as you begin to do that, you have to say, what kind of equality do you want? You can campaign for the right to work, but do you want women to work on the same basis as men, or do you think that most men get a fairly shitty deal as well in terms of the way in which they work? In other words, do we just want equality of the, there's always the argument, should women go and work down coal mines? Well, I suppose my view is if women wanted to go and work down coal mines, that's up to them. But the idea that this is kind of progress, why should anybody be having to work in these kind of jobs, is something that I think we have to look beyond. The same as sexuality. It's a great advance that sexuality is discussed openly, that people can read about sex, they can look at people having sex, they can do all these kind